This video is all about press brakes, or box and pan brakes, or metal bending in general. Machines that bend metal, specifically sheet metal. Very cheap option, much more expensive option. Shall we go about the differences between the two? I think we shall.
Comments have to say about this?
Let's put the Crocs in four-wheel drive for this one. Dude, look how agile I am now. So, in this box is a 24-inch box and pan brake, as it's normally known, sheet metal brake from Vevor. It claims to do 20 gauge mild steel and 14 gauge aluminum, which is pretty common. Most sheet metal brakes of this budget or this type of size usually cap out around 18 gauge, 16 gauge steel. Gauge is of course the thickness of the steel, and the lower the number, ironically, the thicker it is in American sheet metal gauge. I think that's unique to America, I'm not quite sure, but typically if there's any unit of measurement that doesn't make sense, we did it. I have had a 4-foot box and pan brake in the shop for a while. It was actually Wyatt's. So when Wyatt started his own shop, he of course took it. So we don't use it much, but when we do, we need it, which is exactly what somebody said in one of the reviews for this thing. I don't use it often, but when I do, it saves me so much time, and now I can make whatever out of scrap metal we usually have instead of having to wait for the shop to make it. Let's open this, and we're gonna compare the difference between a hand-operated box and pan brake to a CNC press brake. There are similarities, but there are many differences. So, this looks gross and greasy, but it's actually nice to see these things come with an oil coating on them, because the alternative is them rusting when they sit on the shelf, on the rack, on the container ship that they come over on. Okay, so the Vevor 24-inch box and pan brake. So one thing that's different about this brake from the one we had is that there's a lever just on one side. The old one we had a lever on both sides, and you were responsible for locking both sides down before you bend. So how does this work? Well, the simplest answer is you open the jaws, you stick sheet metal in here. Let's pretend this is sheet metal. And you locate it at your bend line. You close the jaws, and then you grab this bottom portion and bend it up. It's the relationship between this front bending die and the back piece and the teeth that are holding the metal down that actually bends the metal. So you can see how tight the gap is between the upper teeth and the bottom bending die. That is the first indication on what thickness of metal this thing's gonna be able to bend. If you put a 1/4-inch piece in there, not only is that gonna, bend our teeth, the physics just don't work. So these things are truly like sheet metal benders. And if you look, when you bend this, you have very little space for the thickness of thicker plate to live. So it definitely has to be thinner stuff. I'm gonna guess that there's not much hardened tool steel involved in the construction of this thing. We've got a pretty typical 4-hole mounting system, so we can screw this down to a workbench or a table or something like that, or make our own feet or stand for it. So they give you some provisions for that. The upper jaws are definitely always gonna have a little bit of movement. They're supported here by these 1/4-inch pieces of flat bar. Here's the pivot pins, and it looks like maybe some spacers or bushings here. I am curious how long this single-sided actuation will hold up. Clearly there's a drive shaft going from the lever to the other side here. So you can see the shaft here that transfers the force from one side to the other. So another reason you can't clamp super hard, meaning you can't bend super thick stuff. So this type of brake is often called a finger brake or a box and pan brake. The reason it's also sometimes called a box and pan brake is because those fingers allow you to bend boxes and pans out of sheet metal. A single solid upper bending die is stronger. So there's less going on. You know, you have to rely on the force of these fasteners to hold these fingers in place. And you can see on the smaller teeth, there's only one fastener. As you get up to this, what looks like 3-inch piece, you have 2 fasteners. And then there's still only 2 fasteners for this much bigger piece. I feel like I would like to see a 3rd fastener here, or maybe even 3 here and 4 here, just to keep the spacing. Come this way. Stored underneath our very leaky and very old hydraulic press is the Swag Off-Road finger brake. Now, this is sort of a hybrid between a press brake and a box and pan brake. It has configurable upper dies, right, that shove the metal into this, well, technically angle iron, but 90-degree lower die. So you can see just how many more fasteners. Now, this is made in the USA by Swag Off-Road. They are awesome. You can see how much more clamping force is actually utilized on a piece like this. That should really illustrate why I reacted so quickly to the lack of fasteners on the Vevor one. Now, granted, this is a press brake more than it is a sheet metal brake, so it has to put up with a lot more force. This is rated for like 1/4-inch steel, I think, full width, assuming you have a press strong enough to push down hard enough. But anyway, that's another offering in the world, a bit of a hybrid between what I've showed you so far and what I'm going to show you later. Right here is a sheet metal brake that we have showed off on the channel before. This is the Eastwood magnetic metal brake. It is also kind of a hybrid between a sheet metal brake and a finger brake or box and pan brake, all meant to bend sheet metal. You get a sense now of like how many names there are for brakes and or how many different types of brakes there are. A lot of them have a big center section in their Venn diagram. You know, they share features and capabilities with each other, but there's a specialty that each one is sort of made for. The cool thing about this Eastwood brake is it's magnetic. It uses the force of magnets to clamp the material down instead of a cam lock or physical or hydraulic or screw force. The cool part about that is as you can see, there's nothing on top of the upper die. So when I click this pedal, the magnet grabs this upper die and holds it down, and then I'm able to do the bending just like on that brake with the pivoting bottom die. And then, you know, I can take this off and remove my part. But the cool thing about this, again, because there's nothing in the way up top, I can clamp this down, bend it to 90, but also keep going. I could bend this to what it says here is 140 degrees. That is a feature that is very, very hard to find on press brakes simply because of the physics involved of how they're built. And this thing claims to have a bending angle of 135 degrees, which is impressive. You know, I don't ever really use a brake like this for anything really more than 90, but I'm gonna add some caveats to their claimed 135 degrees with a brake like this. You're only going to bend a flange 135 degrees if it lands below these fasteners. If it bends up like this, because what they're saying is, you know, that's 90, that's probably 100, that's probably 110, that's probably 120. You know, 135 degrees means that you're slamming this thing all the way up against the upper die, which means that your flange that you're bending is gonna sit right up against here. And if it's higher than these knobs or anything, it's not gonna work. This, for all intents and purposes, should really be used as a 90-degree brake. So, for inquiring minds, this is the W-1.0X610A.
Catchy.
Very catchy name. Hand bending operation manual. So this is called the hand bending, the 24-inch hand bending from Vevor. For the sake of being able to demonstrate all this, I have this strip of 16-gauge aluminum. Now on screen right now is a chart showing sheet metal gauges or AWG, American wire gauge. I think they're the same, I'm not sure. If they're not, this is the sheet metal gauge chart. I do know some shortcuts. So very quickly, 16 gauge just so happens to be 1/16 of an inch. It just works out that way. 1/8 inch is usually either 11 gauge or 10 gauge. You'll see those kind of used interchangeably. And what we have here, which I recommend you to get if you work in sheet at all, this is a wire gauge So because it says wire gauge, I imagine that means that wire gauge and sheet metal gauge is the same standard. You can see, so that's 1 gauge there, the big one, down to 36 gauge, that tiny slit in between there. It's basically a go, no-go gauge, meaning if it fits, you gotta keep going down to the smallest one. So the smallest one that it actually fits in is the gauge. So you can see this is 16 gauge, and if you try to put it in 17 gauge, it doesn't fit. So that's 16 gauge aluminum. Now this thing claims it can do 14 gauge aluminum, so it can do 1 more gauge thicker than this. So this should be a great way to just show you guys what's going on here. I'm just gonna make some quick test pieces, and I'm gonna use a very old piece of equipment to do that. This is a Beverly shear. This one I think is gotta be from the 50s or 60s, but they still make this exact same metal shear today. It is essentially a giant pair of scissors. I'm gonna use it to cut my samples here. This is a really cool tool. It's a throatless shear, meaning you can just keep feeding metal into it. Cut my raw piece. And now I'll just slice up some test coupons here. It will remove your finger without even thinking about it. The only problem with shears, of course, is that it does impart a little bend to your material. So if you really care about it, you can go back and tap it flat. It's really ideal for thinner stuff, but it's faster and it doesn't make a bunch of noise, so I can show you guys that. And let's say, for the sake of example, this thing is 4 7/8. I want to bend it right at the 2-inch mark. So you would mark your bend, you would insert your material into the break, lining your bend mark up with the upper jaws. You then, of course, want to make sure that it's square. You can very easily grab a square and check it off the front face of the bender. You clamp it down, and these are usually cam lock on this type of brake, so you'll feel it kind of engage. Grab these guys, bend it up, and that is how a sheet metal brake works at its most basic level. Got a 90-ish degree bend. I didn't guess, I didn't spend a whole lot of time measuring. This piece looks messed up because of the shear marks, but if you look at that side, pretty good indicator of what you can do. So, something I've always kind of wanted to try. Never really done this, but I've always wanted to try it. Bend it a little bit. Progressive curves with a sheet metal brake. Progressive is probably the wrong word, but see what I mean? You can you could increase your bend radius essentially by getting creative with your bend lines. So there's actually a lot that you can accomplish with something like this. Assuming you have your brake on a level table, which this table is level, theoretically, in the down position, it should be perpendicular to the table. I have one of these digital angle finders, affiliate link below. This is Klein 935 DAG, digital angle gauge. So if you put this on here, you could start it at 90 and then put your metal in here. And if you wanted a perfectly 90-degree bend, you bend this until the angle gauge says 0. Like that. There's your 90-degree bend. Now, that looks a little overbent. So the science of getting a bend perfectly 90 is imperfect. When you're bending sheet metal, you have to account for something called the K factor, which has to do with the amount of metal that you have to move depending on the thickness and the width of bending. So the bend force, as we'll learn over here in the CNC machine, is calculated based on thickness and width, because you could have 2 different bend forces required for the same thickness of material if they're different widths, because if you think about it, there's more material you have to bend. So for something like this and a machine like this, depending on the application, but 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna eyeball it. Now, with aluminum, side note, it does work harden, so the more you bend aluminum, it gets harder and therefore more brittle. So you could use one of these, you could use your eyeball, you could use whatever you want. Some brakes will have angle meters on them, scales, gauges, that sort of thing. For the sub $300 market, you're probably not going to get any of that fluff. So let's test bend angle. So this has a claimed bend angle of 135 degrees. Let's bend it all the way and see how far we get. See, now we're already running into issues where the thickness of the material is getting in its own way, but I did bend it flat against the tooth. So let's figure out what that angle is. So that bend is 52 degrees minus 52, 128 degrees. So claimed 135, we got 128. We could use thinner material and probably push it even further, so sure, we'll give it to them. It's a 135 degree brake. Now, here's what's interesting about the Eastwood magnetic brake. Its sort of claim to fame is I can bend pretty far the way they have this thing marketed. Now, this isn't gonna work because it's not magnetic, but the theory remains that I can now smash it on itself like that. I just made a 180 degree bend. So now you can see the advantage of something like this. It's meant to solve some pretty unique problems. But this is much more expensive than that, so you get what you pay for. That's pretty cool. I would say specifically related to this brake, it's very important you stick to the recommended thicknesses because it's really not going to respond well to thicker material. In fact, if you wanted to push this thing further, it may not be a bad idea to add some fasteners in here. Go ahead and drill a hole and tap a new hole behind here. I'll show you what's behind these teeth. So you can see the mechanism used to hold the tooth in place. There's actually a T-slot, much like you would find on like a milling machine or some sort of, some clamps or fixtures. So that is all you have holding this tooth in, which there's not a very big shoulder on the side of that. So I would be very worried about putting too much force on these teeth, especially that big one. So what you could do is either find these and order more of them and drill more holes in your tooth. That's probably where I'd start. I bet you with enough internet searching, you can find these T-bolts. You see here in the table of our Bridgeport, the same technology. There's a T-shaped slot, and into it goes these T-bolts. So you slide that into the slot, and now you can screw something down to help fixture. But here's an American-made standard T-bolt, and there's the one on the Vevor. You can see how much smaller those little shoulders are. Of the whole brake, which does feel very well made, I would say this right here is the weakest part of it. This is definitely cast. I don't know if this is cast, but I wouldn't weld these on because it's not great to weld cast. However, if you wanted to permanently mount these, you could very easily drill through the back side of here and actually drill and tap the back wall so you don't have to use the T-nuts anymore. When you dig into something like this, you can really start to see why it's so affordable. You know, you gotta be able to cut some corners within reason to make it cheap. So that is the Vevor sheet metal brake. If something of this size would fit in your shop, again, it takes up about 31 inches and it stands about 15 inches tall. So if that's the space you've got to work with and or the bending you need to do is within the specs of this thing, check it out. Feels well made. I may do some modifications to it, but we're definitely going to keep it in our shop for the foreseeable future. Now, very quickly, and we've done several in-depth videos on this machine, so go check those out if you want a deeper dive. This is the Titan 25T CNC press brake from Langmuir Systems. This combines a sheet metal brake and a hydraulic press. It uses, most of the time, hydraulic force. Some will use old sheet metal brakes, could use a screw force, but most of them are hydraulic. But you have a lot of similar characteristics. You have your upper dies, you have your lower dies, but all the bending is done with physical downward pressure versus levers and whatnot. The way this works, you can program certain bends, and to program it, you put in your thickness, your width, your bend location. This actually has a movable bat gauge, or that you can program certain depths so you don't have to mark your bend depth. It'll actually calculate it for you. But I'm gonna home this machine and then I'm gonna run a sample program. So what punch am I using? Well, Langmuir labels all their stuff. So this is the extreme gooseneck. The punch is the top part and the die is the bottom part. So the punch is that, the die is the 4-way die, and I'm using the smallest one, 0.63 inches. Material type is soft aluminum. Desired bend angle is 90. Material thickness is 0.0625. Bend width is 2 inches, roughly. So we hit save, and then load bend into program. I'm gonna delete these other ones I had. All right, so the first thing you do on this machine is touch your 2 palm controls, and what that's gonna do is bring the die down to a point where you can no longer stick your fingers in it. It's a safety method. It's not gonna bend anything yet. It's gonna stop right above the material, just like that. So now you can switch to the foot pedal. So what you're gonna do, whether you're using the bat gauge or not, you put this where you need it to be bent, and you hold it, and you go down, up, down on the foot pedal. It's gonna come down and clamp. Now it's clamped the material. I can let go, the timer counts down, and then it's gonna bend. Doink, executed successfully, and there's a 90. It's pretty good, it's a little underbent, and the cool thing about this is if it's underbent, you can come edit your bend. You can tell it by how much it's underbent. So let's say it's underbent by 5 degrees. Hit that, hit the underbent, go to save, go back to run. I could run my program, yes. It's probably not recommended that you stick it back in there, but I'm going to anyway. Down, up, down on the foot pedal. It's gonna go down and clamp, even though there's nothing to clamp. So because I told it it's underbent by 5 degrees, it's gonna push down a little bit more than it would have. And now it's technically overbent, but the right way to do that would have been to make a new piece, not rebend the same piece, because then the bend characteristics change a little bit. But there you go. That is from simplest, you know what, I suppose simplest would be this.
That works too.
There's the simplest way to bend metal, and there's one of the more complicated ways to bend metal. So I hope that helps orient you within the world of sheet metal brakes. So maximum rated thickness, again, for this guy is 20 gauge steel and 14 gauge aluminum. For this guy, 25-ton CNC press brake, it will do 1/8 inch steel full width, which is 30 or so inches, and up to 1/4 inch, depending on your die and punch combination. And then for our middleman dark horse over here, we've pushed 14 gauge steel through this. I think it's claimed to be an 18 gauge metal brake, but we've done 14 gauge and even some 1/8 inch stuff, depending on width and all that, you know. So all that's listed on the product pages for all these things. All the links for all these things will be down in the description. We love the Langmuir Systems guys. We love the Eastwood guys. There's some really good people, at least in these 2 camps, that really stand behind their products. And let's be honest, this one is the most affordable. And we use a lot of Vevor stuff, and none of it's broken so far. So pretty good value for money. For 5% off this thing, use code VEVT5. That helps us out, helps you save a little bit of coin. Again, all links below. Hope you learned something. Like and subscribe if you have it in your heart. And go check these out and whatever else is out there. Bye.